So today I was on video with For the New Christian Intellectual, and they were discussing race and the Southern Baptist Convention, and how the Southern Baptist Convention has chosen to embrace critical race theory and embrace this idea that people are victims or persecutors based simply on the color of their skin instead of looking at them as individuals. So there's this they're completely ignoring the fact that historically there were a lot of Westerners and people of European descent who were opposed to slavery and fought to end it. They completely ignore the fact that Muslims have historically persecuted large groups of people, and Islam is historically a ideology that persecutes people. Yet somehow we have this idea that white people are labeled as persecutors, as oppressors, and any person of color is labeled as being part of the oppressed. It's this incredible thing that completely ignores history, seeks to rewrite history and completely just get rid of reality and instead replace it with a very disturbing racist ideology that just sees, okay, black people are bad, white people are bad, black people and brown people are good. And there's no nuance. There's nothing in there, and it's totally emotional based. It's not based on reason or logic. And I thought it was definitely a great conversation. Jacob definitely nailed things. Jakob Brunton is absolutely amazing. I definitely see him as one of my heroes as an apologist. However, I think there's more that could be talked about. Now, within the context of the conversation with what was going on with the Southern Baptist Convention, what's going on within the church and with this cultural Marxism within the church, I think that the particular area that Jacob was trying to cover, he covered perfectly. There was almost nothing that could have been, there was almost nothing else that could have been said. The only thing that you could possibly add was asking, well, why are Muslims seen as being oppressed and white people are seen as oppressors, when historically Islam has been a ideology of persecution, whereas referring to the fact that someone's white just means that they happen to have ancestors that came from a particular continent. And there's, some of those ancestors might have been abolitionists, some of them might have been slave owners, so there was good and bad from people who came from Europe, just as there's good and bad from people who came from Africa or Australia or Asia or anywhere else in the world. And certainly there's good and bad from people who came from the Middle East. And you know what? There's good Muslims out there, of course, but there's historically it has been a ideology of persecution. As Stephen Crowder says, not all Muslims are terrorists, but Muhammad was. So there were a couple thoughts that I kind of wanted to make my own video about. And pardon me if it's not super organized. I was thinking about a quote from Stephen Jay Gould. He pointed out that before the time of Darwin, biological arguments for racism existed, but they increased by orders of magnitude following the development of evolutionary theory. So after Darwin's ideas became popular, as they became more widespread, the idea that there was a biological scientific basis for racism became quite common, and that's really where modern racism started. So before that time, there are people who will argue that one group is better than another, but it was seen as being scientifically proven because of what happened in the time of Darwin. And Darwin made some pretty, I'll say, interesting arguments for his racist ideas. While Origin of Species did not cover human evolution so much, and not directly, people understood the implications. And later on, Darwin wrote a book called The Descent of Man. I read quite a large portion of the book, and it was very, very incredibly racist. It argued, based on biology, that certain groups were more highly evolved than others. And he talked in one place about a black woman that he met, who he had some kind of relationship with, whether it was romantic or whether they were just friends wasn't quite clear because of the Victorian euphemisms that I would have to look up. But he said that this particular woman, was just as smart as, any white person. But he said that, she would have been the outlier, essentially. He said that on average, black people would have been biologically inferior. And so that was Darwin's view. This was Darwin's view in his own words. This wasn't something that came from some Bible thumper from the swamp somewhere. Interestingly, I'm in a swamp right now, misrepresenting Darwin. These were Darwin's words himself. So after the time of Darwin, people thought that it was scientifically proven that there were biological races that were different from one another biologically, and B, that some of these races were more highly evolved than others. And in terms of race here, this basically meant like a species or a subspecies. Before the time of Darwin, when he first wrote Origin of Species, he talked about the origin of species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races. In this case, a race didn't necessarily mean the same thing as it came to mean, especially because of Darwin's writings. It basically just meant, you have kind of different varieties. People might talk about the French race and the German race. It could also mean like nationality. So it wasn't as strong of a term as saying that two things were two different species. It was just like, you have maybe slight differences, or you might come from, a different place. But like I said, because of Darwin, it came to mean more species or subspecies. And so people started seeing different groups as being a separate species. There were those who viewed Australian Aborigines as being closer to the apes than to the European man. It was a very, very sad time in history, and there were even those who went to Australia and killed Aborigines and brought their bones to British museums and put them up on display. And they were put up on display as evidence for evolution. And it just amazes me. It's like, people want to rewrite history and try to make it like it was fundamentalist Christians who were the ones promoting racism, as if it was the religious right. But as Thomas Sowell, the economist, points out, the people who were fighting against slavery were what we would today call the religious right. And so, after this time period, you saw these ideas spread. They spread across the Atlantic. They spread in Europe. American progressives took these ideas and said, well, okay, some groups are better than others. They created what were known as human zoos. So they had people being put in zoos as if they were animals, because they saw them as being lesser races. There's a famous story of a pygmy from Africa who was put in a zoo in the monkey exhibit. And later, my understanding is that he committed suicide. This is incredible. And now, today, the left wants to talk about how bad racism is, how bad slavery is, or how bad slavery was. Really? It was Democrats pushing for this stuff. It was left-wing progressives pushing for this stuff. And it's not, and they'll try to say, oh, well, the parties switched. It's like, no, the same people that they prop up as heroes openly promoted racism. Margaret Sanger talked about wanting to get rid of black people and talking about them being like they were human weeds. So this was part of the same era, the same strain of thought that you had with human zoos. She saw certain groups of people as being less than people. And I guess what do you expect? Now I very much don't agree with presuppositionalism. However, worldviews do play a role in how you see the world around you. When I believed in evolution and I'd walk through places like this, I saw a very different forest than what I see now. And in the same way, when you look at people, they viewed people as being just another animal. Sadly, ideas have consequences. And the little baby snake. Ideas have consequences. As a result of what the American left did, Germans were influenced by this. And that's what led to the Holocaust. This idea that some people were more highly evolved than others became mixed in with a lot of politics, a lot of collectivism, a lot of ideas that are very objectionable and very contrary to the notion that all men are created equal and endowed with inalienable rights by their creator. And this is something that the Founding Fathers talked about, and it's really important to understand where did that come from. How you doing? If someone wants to say that there is no creator, then the idea that human beings are given inalienable rights by their creator, logically it falls apart. So there's a lot of issues here, a lot of things that came into play, and I wish that there's a lot of history to go over in a lot of detail. But if you ever take the time to watch some of the Nazi propaganda, or read some of Hitler's writings, and believe me, I have, this is not the writings of somebody who we might think of as a Trump supporter. This is not the writings of an Ayn Rand. This is not the writings of a Thomas Sowell. This is not the writings of somebody with a conservative or a Christian worldview. And I know some of the people I mentioned were not necessarily Christians, but there is this influence from the Christian worldview that people are endowed with rights from God. That nobody can be seen as being more of a person than another person. Even a king in the Old Testament had no right to steal from a man just because he was the king. He had no right to unjustly kill somebody just because he was the king. At least no right before God. There were kings who did wickedness, who persecuted people, and God ends up judging them for it. So I know that would be a whole theological study by itself to get into, to talk about how throughout the Bible there is a certain sense in which all human beings are created equal, even if we might have different positions in the world, or in different positions given to us by God. But this idea of racism, the idea that one human being was closer to the apes than to another human being, totally foreign idea. So yeah, this, like I said, ideas have consequences, and I just find it so amazing that there are those who want to rewrite history, to create a narrative that simply doesn't exist, that doesn't fit with the facts of history. And if people want to do that, I can't stop them, but we are obligated to point out the lies, to show what is true, to say, no, Adolf Hitler was not a right-wing Christian fundamentalist. Adolf Hitler was a Darwinian socialist. It's even in the name, Nazi, the National Socialist Workers' Party. No, there was no big switch between Republicans and Democrats, and the very same Democrats that are praised by the modern left today openly promoted racist policies. As I mentioned in my recent article, The Aftermath of Black Lives Matter, I'm not going to lean on that, there were the very first minimum wage laws in this country were created explicitly to favor white workers over black workers. Now, today, minimum wage laws might not have that explicit intent, but I'd be willing to bet that Democrats are fully aware that minimum wage hurts the poor, and they're intending to keep poor people